when you come into an organization, particularly now, to your point, Brandon, so many people are moving, right? Every couple of years we're moving on. I said, don't make the mistake that so many managers make of sitting down with their staff. Okay, I'm the president and, she's the VP of marketing, she's the VP of sales, she's the CFO, and just look at those people for the roles they're in. Ask for their bios, ask for their resumes, ask for the CVs, sit down with them and understand where they came from. Your VP of marketing may have been a CEO who sold her business for $10 million, right? She may have completely different experience other than the role they're in. One of the mistakes we make as leaders and managers, Brandon, is we look at people and define them by the role they're in.
Hey everyone, this is the Leadership Foundry podcast, and I'm your host for this week. I'm Brandon Smith, and I'm really excited for our show today. We've got Jim Wetrich. Jim is the CEO of Wetrich Group of Companies. He's also the author of Stifled, Where Good Leaders Go Wrong. That was just released in 2021. And I really enjoyed my conversation here with Jim. We really talked about a couple things. We spent some time talking about the future of leadership, which is one of the topics we really like to talk about on this show. But we also spent time talking about when leaders go wrong, when they make missteps. What are some of those most common missteps? So we can learn from those to make us all better leaders tomorrow. So listen really close to my conversation with Jim. And of course, at the end of this episode, I'll share with you all the notes that I took away.
Welding together practical insights and powerful conversations to forge world-class leaders. This is the Leadership Foundry podcast. Now, here's this week's host, Brandon Smith, co-founder of the Leadership Foundry.
Jim, so excited to have you on the Leadership Foundry podcast here today. I'm really excited about our conversation. We're talking about leadership and talking about your most recent book. But before we jump into that topic, just for my listeners that maybe haven't gotten a chance to be exposed to you before, share a little bit about not only what you're up to today, but what's been your leadership journey? What's kind of gotten you on this path?
Yeah, great, Brandon. Thank you. And I'm honored and delighted to be with you today, too. And I'm so excited about your show. I've been absolutely blessed. I've been working for 40 years. I've been in the healthcare, medical device, pharmaceutical space. And I've worked for just absolutely, for the most part, Brandon, some amazing leaders. Every one of my leaders that I've worked for, except for the first person that I worked for, went on to be a CEO or an officer in a public or private company. I've worked for amazing people, and I've been blessed in that regard. And the other thing, I learned about Warren Buffett's book on becoming a leader in 1989, and I bought the book. And when I buy books, Brandon, I actually write the date that I bought the book on the inside and my name. I don't know. I've always done that. And I bought the book right after it came out, and I was hooked. I loved his message. I loved the story in there. I loved Warren's approach. And years later, I got a chance to sit down one afternoon and spend an afternoon with Warren talking about leadership. And Wow. It just, that one moment became a pivot in my life where I really started focusing on leadership, and it became a passion of mine.
That's great. So Jim, now if we fast forward to today, how do you spend your time today? How do you see leadership playing out in your world today?
Yeah. So Brandon, much like you in your background, although it's been most recent for me, I've put a plan together to get into the executive and professional coaching business. I wanted to sort of wind down my consulting business and move into coaching. And I got a certificate 3 years ago, and I've really been focusing most of my time on doing executive coaching. And so, leadership and mentoring is really an important part of that journey. And I think, I don't think we all know everything's turned upside down in the last couple of years. And there have been and will continue to be some radical changes just in the way we work.
Yeah. So I want to, something you said, I want to go back in time for a minute, and then we're going to go into the future. So let's go back in time first. You made this subtle comment, Jim. It was subtle, but I heard it. You said, all my leaders that I've ever worked for, they all moved on to these, leadership roles, kind of senior officer roles in corporations and companies, except for the first one. So was there something interesting about or noteworthy about that first leader?
Well, there's a great question. and your counseling and coaching skills come through. You're obviously a great listener. Dave Gammon was my first boss, and he was the general manager or store manager of a grocery store out in Southern California, a small chain of stores called Stater Brothers. And that's just what he did for a living. That was for him as sort of his pinnacle. He just wanted to run the grocery store. I was the proverbial bag boy or box boy. But interestingly enough, Dave was definitely in the top 2 or 3 of the best leaders I've ever worked for, because Dave did everything. He never told people what to do. This is going back to the mid-'70s when everything was command and control, but Dave never told you what to do. He'd ask you what to do, and he always did it himself. If you need to take, people's groceries out into the car and load the groceries in the car, he'd do it. If you need to sweep up the cigarette butts in the parking lot, he'd do it. Break down cardboard, whatever it was, Dave was always doing everything. And nothing was beneath him, and everybody loved him because he was just one of us, and he was always working super hard when things got really busy.
See, Jim, that was not the answer I thought you were going to give me. I thought you were going to give me a story similar to mine, where my first boss was not so effective, but I loved your story more. And here's why I loved it so much, because you just reminded every single one of us that great leadership has nothing to do with your title, and it can come in small ways.
Yeah,
you can have a huge impact on the people around you, the community you're in, and form future leaders sitting in a role that others might see as a small role, but it doesn't mean it's not impactful, and you can't make a change in others' lives. I love that.
Thank you. You'd love how he used to hire box boys. He'd meet them at the front of the store, and there was a second-story office that went up some back stairs that overlooked the cash registers, right? So he could look down on what was happening in the store. And he'd meet the potential box boy at the front, and then he'd almost run back to the store, up the back stairs, and into the office. And he'd turn around when he got to the office door. Obviously, the office door was locked. And if the box boy to be wasn't on his heels, he wouldn't hire him. It was all about hustle. That was his sole criterion.
Interesting.
For hiring people. Yeah.
Okay. So, Jim, you've been masterfully, without even knowing it, setting up my next question.
Yeah, great.
So you talked in this story about Dave, you said in mid-'70s, kind of command and control. That wasn't his style, but that was the kind of common style.
Yeah.
So now let's fast forward a little bit to today, and I want to put my crystal ball in front of you.
Yeah.
As you look out into the future of leadership, what do you see? What do you think the future leaders, the most effective ones, are going to look like in terms of their actions, behaviors, attitudes, values? There's no real right or wrong answer to the question. It's mostly when you peer into the crystal ball, what's that image of leadership for you?
Yeah, that's a great question, Brandon. I think it's a combination of a number of things. One is self-awareness is always so critical, right? Who am I? What do I stand for? What's important to me? And development. I still think that one of the most important things leaders can do for their people is to develop them, help them grow, right? Most people come to work every day wanting to do a good job and grow and develop. And I'd say in almost all the coaching I do right now, particularly with people that are 40 and younger, they're all looking for, how do I learn? How do I do more? How do I grow? Where are my gaps? I know what my strengths are. I know what my passions are, but what else can I do to really grow? So I think continuous growth and development, clearly, vision of being able to set a strategy, being able to make bold decisions. And one of the great things, if there are any, that came out of the pandemic was so many companies realized they could change on a dime. So many companies pivoted overnight, did things that they never thought they could have done in those period of times, not to mention the least of which was working from home. I'll be the first to tell you, I was a skeptic. I didn't think we could make the pivot and work from home as effectively as we have, but it's shown a lot of us that it is indeed possible. So, and then the last thing I think, Brandon, that's so important is more than ever, because we're not face-to-face a lot, we're not, in the cafeteria, we're not at the coffee pot, we're not in the conference room. It's so important to look at the whole person and understand, how Jim Wetrich shows up to work is not how Jim Wetrich shows up to work. It's what's happening in Jim Wetrich's life. What's going on? Is there stress? Can I not pay my bills? Am I having trouble with a family member? Am I scared to death of getting COVID, even if I get COVID and I'm not bad? So really looking at the whole person and not just Jim Wetrich from 8 to 5 or 7 to 7 or whatever the hours are. I think that's really going to be critical. And finding ways to connect with people at work and outside of work is going to be critical.
It's interesting. As you were talking about looking at the whole person, what came to mind for me, and I'd be curious to your thoughts and experience around this. Naturally, in more recent years, we haven't done a very good job of that. I think the workplace seems to be a little more of a transactional place. You kind of come in, you work, you go, and you work there for maybe a couple of years, you go find another job. But you go back in time into the 80s and even before, people worked at the same place for 30 years. That was kind of what you did.
Absolutely.
And my sense is your manager or your leader would get to know your spouse or get to know your family and ask you questions about how are things at home. That was a little more of a. So are we? Is this a new thing, or is the pendulum swinging maybe back in a way that's a little more healthy? I'm curious to your thoughts.
Yeah, I think it's predominantly a new thing, but one of the pieces of guidance that I give to people is when you come into an organization, particularly now, to your point, Brandon, so many people are moving, right? Every couple of years we're moving on. I said, don't make the mistake that so many managers make of sitting down with their staff. Okay, I'm the president, and she's the VP of marketing, she's the VP of sales, she's the CFO, and just look at those people for the roles they're in. Ask for their bios, ask for their resumes, ask for the CVs, sit down with them and understand where they came from. Your VP of marketing may have been a CEO who sold her business for $10 million, right? She may have completely different experience other than the role they're in. One of the mistakes we make as leaders and managers, Brandon, is we look at people and define them by the role they're in. Right? So what were they doing? Maybe you've got a whole bunch of people with a whole bunch of talent and capabilities. You have no idea because you see Jim Wetrich as the VP of sales or the regional manager or the financial analyst or whatever. And I coach everyone who's in a leadership position. Sit down, get to know your people, figure out what their backgrounds are. Where did they come from? I coached a lady recently, Brandon. She was so abused in her house when she was either 12 or 14, I can't remember. She actually left home and was homeless for 2 years.
Wow.
She was the head of learning and development at a huge organization. Imagine how that impacted who she is and what she's capable of doing and the resilience that she had. But if you didn't sit down and just get to know her, you never probably would have heard that story.
Yeah. Interesting. So I want to get to your book, but I've got a follow-on question to that story, that example, Jim. So tell me a little bit about, from your perspective, how much of it is a responsibility of the person to be asked that question, so to learn more about her and find out that beautiful part of her journey, and how much of it is for her to share that proactively with the people that she's working with?
It's a great question. And I think it's a two-way street. I think it's 50-50. And I give a lot of people that advice on coaching, right? Your manager or your manager's manager, right, which is even probably more important, has no idea about your background. Find ways to make sure they understand who you are and what your background is. So I think it's a great question, Brendan. I think it's a two-way street. People assume that somehow my manager or manager's manager knows me, right? Well, if you don't have ever had a conversation or sent some paper to them or sent an email or spent some time just in kind of an exploratory, introductory, get to know me, once I've been hired process, it'll never happen. It'll never. More often than not, it just won't happen.
Agreed. I think so. I love that. I think it's, and you said two-way street. I almost think it's kind of vertical too. So it's our responsibility to ask our folks a little more about their stories and journeys, and of course, don't probe. I mean, let them share what they're comfortable sharing. But I think also as leaders, it's our responsibility to share those parts of our story. I can imagine if I was working with her, how much grace and I would give her, and how much purpose I would see in what she did every day, knowing that story about her. Because it's almost like, she didn't get all this coaching and development and encouragement, and now she's trying to pour that into the world. That's such a motivating, inspiring story. So if she came off a little gruff one day, I would totally give her a hall pass. I would say,
amen.
I would say, I get it. I get it. You're
for sure.
Versus not knowing that story, I would say she's just mean. And she reminds me of my third grade mean teacher, which,
having a bad day today. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So I want to pivot. 2021, you released Stifled, Where Good Leaders Go Wrong.
Yep.
So tell us a little bit about that book. What was the impetus that really brought you to write that book? And then I'd love to kind of dive into it and kind of hear from you some of those things that you see are the hallmarks of when leaders make missteps. What does that look like?
I think some of it, thank you, Brandon. I think some of it is subtle, right? There's subtle things that leaders do that they don't necessarily think about, the impact on the organization. And I'll give you a good example of that in a second. And some of it is just outright bad leadership. And there's so many issues, even still today, with the way people lead and manage. I just thought it was important to, in some cases, really call things out and make sure people understand how their behavior is coming across and the impact they're having on their organization. One of the things that I mentioned is companies often say, if you're going to be promoted, if you're going to, become a district manager in our company, if you want to go from sales to being a district manager, you've got to come inside, you've got to work in this department, you've got to come in for 2 years, and we're not making any exceptions. Well, I was in a company that did that, and not more than 2 months after that decree and mandate came out, they had a situation where they promoted a sales rep directly to a district manager who never came in to do this job they were talking about. Look, Brandon, you and I both know exceptions are always going to happen. They just are, right? But be transparent and say, look, this is our general path. Don't say this is the only path. This is the general path. We have the right to make exceptions. We may make exceptions in really important situations, but what happens is people manage black and white. You must do this. And then when they don't follow that themselves, it really impacts the leader, in my opinion, the leader's or manager's credibility and the organization's credibility.
Yeah, I'm also hearing in this consistency and the importance of consistency in terms of kind of doing what you say you're going to do. And if you think there's going to be some possible pivots, be clear on that. I mean, because
absolutely. I mean, the one thing you learn working in a big company is there's always going to be exceptions. I could spend several podcasts with you talking about all the exceptions I've seen in my career. It happens. It just does. But let's just be transparent about it. Let's be open about it.
And I would say that we're probably have seen a lot more of that over the last 18 months.
No doubt.
Because to your comment earlier that so many leaders, in companies realized because they had to, we can actually pivot and change around
Absolutely.
Here. And there's kind of almost two actions in this. There's the pivoting itself, and then there's the communication all around it.
Yeah.
And if this part's not done quite right, it sounds like this could be misconstrued a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so all right, so we've got this idea of one of the ways that leaders can kind of make, where good leaders can go wrong is they may not be transparent or as consistent. They may that's kind of one of those missteps. Any other kind of highlights that you would spell out, the things that you've seen recently that you brought into the book that are some of those things that leaders just they make those steps and boy, it costs them.
I'd say one of the key areas still, Brandon, is performance management. Some companies are still stuck on an annual performance management process, and it's so passé, it's so old school. How can you give me one performance review for a year, which mostly in many cases is based on what my actual objectives were, right? I don't need a manager. I don't need a leader to tell me whether or not I hit my sales number, my revenue number, my profit number, my expense number. I can do that pretty much on my own, right? Either I hit my goal or I didn't. But we spend hours and hours and hours documenting this stuff with very little advice. And one of the big criticisms I have of the whole process is, and particularly now, it's even more important, managers are judging people and they have no idea how they're managing, right? So in one of my jobs, I was remote and my manager was not anywhere near me. And he never came to one of my staff meetings. He never came to one of my sessions one-on-one with one of my employees. He never came to exhibits where I stood up with the rest of the sales force and talked to customers, right? And everything was sort of, critique and evaluation remotely. right? Part of the problem managers are getting into is they're not being mentored and they're not being coached and counseled. That manager had no idea whether or not I was abusing my people, or if I was an SOB in the office, or if I was coming in at 10 o'clock and leaving at 2 o'clock. He never interacted with me. And it's not a criticism to him. We were in a different part of the world. But how can you judge me just based on a few metrics when you aren't spending time with me evaluating how I'm interacting? And that's where a huge breakdown is occurring, because managers are able to be lousy, right? They can perform, but we're not, as leaders, we're not in tune to what's happening really with the people we're evaluating, and it's really crazy.
Okay, Jim, you hit on something that's going to be a problem going forward, a big one, because we're now moving to this hybrid workplace.
Right.
And this is what a lot of companies are making concessions. Oh, yeah, you can work remote and I'll just manage you remote. And then that's going to work that way. But you're right. I had lunch with a group of leaders yesterday, actually. And one of them said, they said, what we've loved is we've been doing these quarterly meetings where we've all come together. It's a group of sales leaders. So they get together quarterly. And they said, it's been great to just connect and see each other. But the leader of the group said, one of the benefits of this last meeting we got together was this one individual on our team. And he's known as a high performer. He closed a deal, but he wasn't doing the final things he needed to do to kind of wrap the deal up. And when I sat there being in front of him, I noticed he was working very inefficiently. So a high performer, but he's probably working 65, 70 hours a week.
Right.
And he wasn't doing the right things, and he was making the organization do a lot of heavy lifting. He was asking for a lot of requests that he didn't need to be asking for. And by watching him work, I realized there were some things I could coach him on. If I hadn't been there watching him just over a Zoom, I wouldn't have been able to see this. And then we probably would have burned the guy out, because he's a high performer. We would have given him more. He's already at 70 hours. Where's he gonna put that in? He's not gonna put that in. So I think you make a good point that there's so much value in being with people when we're trying to provide coaching and management, not only on behaviors where maybe you're a little off the mark over here, but also inefficiencies. It's like, gosh, you could do this so much smarter, or try this.
Absolutely.
And you just can't do that well with Zoom or Teams or whatever else you're using.
Yeah, absolutely. Great point, Brandon.
Okay, so we're going to go back to the crystal ball. Since we're on that particular topic, how do we solve for that? If you think about leaders that are going to be in this new normal, where you've got folks that are, and maybe it's sales team, and and they're located in different regions, and they're working virtually. How do we ensure that we solve for that?
I think there's a couple things, Brandon, that all kind of come together. One is communication. We right now are absolutely burying everybody in communication. I've got to check my messages on Teams. I've got to go to Slack. I've got to go to Outlook. I've got to go to my WhatsApp. I've got to go to my text message. I got to check my voicemail. Time out, everybody. Time out. Let's figure out the portal or two we're going to use to communicate. I can't spend all day chasing where I need to find my messages. It's completely inefficient. And the same thing is true, Brandon, about meetings. We've got way too many meetings. There's been study after study after study after study showing that there's billions of dollars lost every year by companies around the world. And I put this in my book, having too many meetings, right? And the other thing that's happening is now I can schedule, if I'm your boss or you're my boss, you can schedule me on Zoom calls from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. Nobody's getting a break. Nobody's building into the schedule a break. No Zoom calls between 12 and 2, Eastern time or whatever it is.
Yeah.
It's personal time. It's quiet time. It's exercise time. It's break time. It's take a mental break time. But I can't tell you, and I know you know as well as I do, how many times you're talking to somebody and they're like, we're in the middle of a conversation. I got to go. I got another Zoom. My Zoom starts in 2 minutes. I got to go. It's so many things. I feel, Brandon, never get to conclusion because we're jumping from one Zoom to another. Take a time out, right? I mean, in the old days, meetings would run late, right? How many times you stood outside the conference room waiting for the 8 o'clock meeting to end so you could start your 10 o'clock meeting, right? Yeah. We didn't just stop because of an artificial, calendar or clock or something. we tried to get things to conclusion. I think part of what's happening is we're racing around and chasing, from meeting to meeting, and a lot of things aren't getting done. So I think all these things are really important, and there's ways to also get feedback, right, from my coworkers, from my staff, from the people I'm working with, the team members. Quick pulse survey. If Wetrich is working 70 hours a week and I'm, spending 30 hours a week chasing down stuff I shouldn't be chasing or wasting company resources, there's ways, techniques, and pulse surveys, feedback from my team to maybe help identify that a little bit.
I love that. So I think everything you said in that last kind of moment there, we could all put in the category of noise. So much noise that we're frankly creating. It's noise we're creating. Hey, Jim, I'm going to reach out to you. I'm going to send you a Teams message. No, I'm going to text you. And I'll send you an email. I'm probably going to leave you a voicemail too. And I might even send you a certified letter. I'm not quite sure. It's possible. So, and then we all have our preferences, right? I know if someone sends me an email, that's my go-to. I'm going to respond quickly because I can loop in my assistant. If you send me a text, it's going to be a little longer delay. You send me a voicemail, I don't know when I'm going to have time to answer that because I'm booked so solid, because that goes to the second one. I've got all the meetings that are back to back to back to back to back, right? So it becomes an interesting thing. It's all about kind of how do we put in more focus and boundaries. And so I think you've nailed it there. Jim, this has been an absolute pleasure. So I ask all my guests on the Leadership Foundry podcast this question. This podcast and what we're all about is practical tips. And you've given us so many here today. So if you could think of one practical tip, one practical first step that leaders listening to this today could start doing tomorrow to make them better, what would that be?
I'll end with a quote that I put in my book from my good friend, mentor, Bob Parkinson, who passed away a couple of years ago. He was in his last job, retired chairman and CEO of Baxter. He had been COO at Abbott Laboratories. And he said, be committed to developing people. Most have more potential than ever realized, but need a leader to nurture their confidence.
That's great. So just that, be committed to developing people.
Yep. And I think seeing potential in people that often we don't see, because we just look at people, with a lens and say, Jim's this, Jim's that. But maybe Jim could do a lot of different things if Jim was developed and we found his real sweet spot and his real passion.
Yeah. And what I love about that, be committed to developing people, is it ties into so many other things we've talked about today. Well, to do that well, I should sit down and actually get to know them. So
Absolutely.
Jim, what are your goals? I mean, maybe you're just really comfortable right here. You're a general manager of a grocery store and you love being a general manager of the grocery store. You love the community.
Absolutely.
You do not want to get promoted to corporate because this town is your family. Or maybe you've got real big aspirations that one day you want to have, you want to be a CEO of a grocery store chain. I don't know that until I sit down and ask you. So it sounds like you've laid out some really great steps for us today. Well, Jim, if people want to buy a copy of your book, Stifled, Where Good Leaders Go Wrong, or if they want to learn anything about you or frankly follow you, where can they go?
I'm very thank you for Brandon for saying that. I'm very active on LinkedIn. You can find me on LinkedIn. My profile's James G. Wetrich. You can go to jimwetrich.com, which tells you a lot about the book and how to buy it. And you can also find it on Amazon.
Yeah. Jim, well, this was an absolute pleasure. And
it was a delight.
And something that we haven't shared, you're also a fellow Emory MBA. So we've got that in common too. So good to connect with you. Thank you for coming on the show today. And most importantly, thank you for sharing all of your wisdom with all of us today. It's going to make us all better leaders starting tomorrow. So thank you.
It's a delight to be with you, and thank you for all you do and all you've done. It's fabulous, the work you're doing.
Now, folks, wasn't that a good show? I told you Jim was going to have a lot to say. And he reminded us of some things that some we know and some were new. So he told us, of course, that leadership has changed a lot over the years. And he painted that picture of future leader. He said that future leader, she or he's going to have real strong self-awareness. They're going to really focus on growing others. And he told us, for the leaders he talks to today, when they have direct reports that are 40 and younger, this is a huge priority for them. They're going to be able to paint vision and make decisions. And they're going to be willing to change and pivot on a dime. And he reminded us that, of course, leaders, we've all learned this over the last 18 months. And they're going to look at the whole person. So when I talked to Jim about his book, Stifled, he highlighted a few big missteps. He said where leaders go wrong, first, when they do make those changes, they're not transparent about it, or it doesn't feel consistent, and that really breaks down trust. They do performance management incorrectly. They're still stuck to that annual review. And that's a real problem if we're dealing with folks that we're managing remotely. And Jim and I had a whole conversation about how to do that more effectively remotely. And then he finally said a couple of ways that we can get better. Gosh, with communication, don't be communicating with people with 4, 5, 6 different portals. He said, pick 1 or 2. Is it Slack? Is it Teams? Is it email? Is it text? Pick your 1 or 2, but don't allow all those to exist. Just creates more noise. And speaking of noise, he talked about meetings and too many of them and how we need to build a little more of a buffer so we can actually close out the content in those meetings and actually move to some forward momentum. And when I pressed Jim on what's that one practical thing we could be doing starting tomorrow to make us a better leader, he said, focus on the commitment to developing people. Commit yourself to developing your folks, which then will enable a lot of the other things Jim talked about today. So I love that show. It gave me a lot to think about, and hopefully it gave you a practical tool or tip that you can take away starting tomorrow to make you a better leader.